Good evening. I'm Joseph Dobrian. On last week's show, I gave a little lecture on the 1964 presidential campaign, which was one of the most interesting in my memory. The first one I followed, as a matter of fact. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the 1968 presidential campaign, which was just about as interesting and certainly much more suspenseful than the 1964 campaign. Now, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, who was the incumbent president, won in a landslide over Barry Goldwater. He was permanently ensconced with a veto-proof Congress, so he was able to pass all kinds of social legislation. He also got us very deeply involved in Vietnam. So those were the big issues going into the 1968 campaign. First was, should we remain in Vietnam, and if so, in what capacity, or should we get the heck out of there? The other one was the social issues, the social legislation. How powerful should the government be in terms of providing various social services, establishing a welfare state, interfering, or some would say assisting with business regulation and so forth. Now, Lyndon Johnson was domestically very lefty, liberal, progressive, and he was responsible for the so-called Great Society program, which some people would say backfired terribly. But he was also a little bit warlike. He got us involved in the Vietnam War, much more so than we had been before. And that really is what he is remembered for, as well as his various social programs. Well, by the beginning of 1968, it was pretty clear to most observers that we were just not going to succeed in our mission in Vietnam. We were committing hundreds of thousands of troops there. Hundreds of young men were getting killed every week. And it looked like it was all for naught. They were all dying in vain. Even Walter Cronkite, who was regarded then as probably the most trustworthy journalist in America, remarked that it looked like we were spinning our wheels in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson looked like he was going to be running for another term as president. Constitutionally, he was able to do that because he had only been elected once, and he had only filled a little more than a year of President Kennedy's unexpired term. So he was constitutionally eligible to run for re-election. And most people believed that he would be nominated easily enough and that he would probably be re-elected. At the start of the 1968 campaign, it looked like the Republicans had several possible candidates. One was Richard Nixon, who had been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower and had lost the 1960 presidential campaign to John F. Kennedy. 2 years later, he had been defeated in a race for governor of California. And at that time, people just assumed that his political career was over, that he maybe would be an elder statesman but would never run for significant public office again. But Nixon, after the disastrous 1964 election, thought that 1968 might provide him with another opportunity. So in the midterm elections of 1966, he traveled all over the country working his tail off for various congressional and senatorial candidates, and gubernatorial candidates too, of course. He worked his butt off. He helped a lot of Republican candidates, and he accumulated a lot of IOUs. All of these people he had helped would now be obligated to him and would help him to secure the nomination in 1968, or that was his strategy at any rate. Now, at the very beginning of the 68 campaign, it looked like his main opponent for the nomination would be Governor George Romney of Michigan, the father of Mitt Romney, who ran for president 4 years ago. George Romney was highly regarded, and he looked presidential. He was this handsome man with iron gray hair slicked back. He was very distinguished looking, and he was Central Casting's idea of a president. Unfortunately, he didn't really know how to campaign, and he appeared to be not that bright. So some people thought he was a lightweight. Other people thought he was better than Nixon anyway, because Nixon had a personality that wasn't to everybody's tastes, and he had a reputation as a loser, having lost the 1960 presidential campaign and then the 1962 gubernatorial campaign. So a lot of Republicans were thinking, let's go with Romney. He's a winner. He's very popular in his home state, and so on. Then waiting in the wings were two other possible candidates for the Republican nomination. One was Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York. Now, it looked like he was probably going to support Romney, but just in case Romney didn't make it, Rockefeller would be there ready to step in and claim the nomination. He represented more the left wing of the Republican Party. Nixon was more of a centrist. And then another possible candidate who had the support of much of the right wing of the Republican Party was the new governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Reagan had been elected governor of California in 1966, defeating the Democrat incumbent. And a lot of people were saying, what? An actor? A TV and movie actor as governor of California, much less as president of the United States? That's crazy. But a lot of people said, so what if he used to be an actor? He's a darn good politician and he knows what he's doing. So there was wide difference of opinion about Ronald Reagan, but he was being mentioned as a possible candidate for the Republican nomination. He was personable. He represented sort of the Goldwater wing of the party. So who knows? Who knew what could happen? Meanwhile, on the Democrat side, there was a senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy, who represented the far left of the Democratic Party. And he decided he was going to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the Democrat nomination. Now, he didn't expect that he was likely to get the nomination, but he wanted to give people another choice besides Johnson, who was not popular and who was perceived as a warmonger and not really sympathetic to the liberal wing of the party. So Gene McCarthy kind of represented what today we would call the yuppie types, the prosperous white professional class voter. Didn't have a lot of support among black people or among other minorities. But one possible candidate who did have a lot of support among blacks and Hispanics especially was Senator Robert Kennedy of New York, the brother of the assassinated President Kennedy. Robert Kennedy hadn't declared his candidacy yet, but a lot of people were urging him to run for the nomination against Lyndon Johnson. At first, Kennedy refused to do this, but wait, it gets better. Now, in those days, the Iowa caucus was not particularly relevant. The first major test of the primary season was the New Hampshire primary, which would be held in March of 1968. Now, George Romney was campaigning hard in New Hampshire, but he just wasn't gaining any traction. He came across as a decent enough guy who just wasn't cut out to be president and just frankly wasn't bright enough for the job. And the polls showed him losing terribly to Nixon, which would have ruined his chances of ever getting the nomination. So a few weeks before the New Hampshire primary, Romney dropped out of the race, leaving Nixon pretty much alone in the field. Meanwhile, on the Democrat side, the race in New Hampshire was between President Johnson and Senator McCarthy, and everybody expected Johnson to win handily. But on the night of the New Hampshire primary, Nixon, as expected, won easily because he didn't have much opposition at all. Johnson won the primary against McCarthy, but boy, it was close. It was like 49% for Johnson, 42% for McCarthy. And if you counted the write-in votes on the Republican side of the ballot, it was almost a tie. Johnson just barely squeaked out a victory. So the Democrat nomination all of a sudden was up for grabs. To make matters even more complicated, at about this same time, Robert Kennedy, seeing what had happened in New Hampshire and seeing now that Johnson was in fact vulnerable, said, "Hey, hang on, folks, I'm getting in the race after all." So now you had a three-way race: Johnson, McCarthy, and Kennedy. On the Republican side, it looked like Nixon was going to sail into the nomination unopposed, but wait a minute. Nelson Rockefeller wasn't having any of that. He decided that he had to oppose Nixon because Nixon was just too far to the right for him. Nixon wasn't actually that far to the right, but he was farther to the right than Rockefeller, who was really more of a Democrat than a Republican. So first, Rockefeller made it clear that he was planning to run for the Republican nomination. But then he issued a statement saying that he wasn't going to run after all. He was going to back off. He might accept a draft. You know, if people really wanted him to run, they could vote for him, but he wasn't going to campaign. A lot of his supporters were very, very disappointed at this. But what I think he was doing was holding back because he knew that the upcoming primaries were all in Nixon country, and he wasn't going to win. And if he didn't win those primaries, of course, his candidacy would have no credibility whatsoever. So I think he was just hanging back, playing a waiting game. On the Democrat side, though, Johnson was terribly disheartened by how poorly he had done in the New Hampshire primary. He was also in very poor health. He was much sicker than he looked at that time. And in fact, he did not have long to live. He died about 5 years later. But he wanted to focus on ending the war in Vietnam if he could, and leave that as his legacy, and not involve himself in a presidential campaign. So a few days after the New Hampshire primary, he withdrew. He said, "I'm not going to run for another term." So that left McCarthy and Kennedy both on the left wing of the party, both appealing to the same demographic largely, although Kennedy had more support among minorities than McCarthy did. Johnson did not like either of them. Johnson, as a matter of fact, detested both of them. So he urged his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to get into the race, and he promised that he would lend Humphrey all of his support. Now, it was too late for Humphrey to get into the primaries. But in those days, the primaries were not as important as they are now. Only a few states had primaries. In most states, the delegates were chosen by party bosses. And among these people, Lyndon Johnson still had a great deal of power and influence, and he could persuade them to appoint slates of delegates that would be sympathetic to his man, Hubert Humphrey. So you've got uncertainty now in both parties. After Nixon had won a few primaries, Rockefeller decided, well, now come the primaries in some of the western states where I might stand a chance of winning, so I'm going to get back into the race. Rockefeller announced that he was indeed a candidate after all, but it was starting to look like it might be too late for him because Nixon had already racked up a lot of committed delegates. So it still looked like Nixon would be the heavy favorite going into the convention. On the Democrat side, Bobby Kennedy was winning most of the primaries now. McCarthy had won the Wisconsin primary before Kennedy had entered the race, but now Kennedy was winning primaries in Indiana, Nebraska, Massachusetts, and it looked like he was rolling up a pretty sizable number of delegates. A lot of people who weren't really aware of what was going on thought that Kennedy, if he won enough primaries, would just steamroller his way to the nomination. What they didn't understand was that Humphrey and Johnson were working behind the scenes to secure as many delegates as possible for Hubert Humphrey. So in early June of 1968 was the California primary, and that was going to be the culminating primary. That was going to, people thought that would decide the issue, because in the California primary, the two Democrat opponents were Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy. And a lot of people thought that whichever of them won the California primary would be well poised for the nomination. Humphrey had announced his candidacy too late to be in the California primary. He wasn't on the ballot at all, so it was just a two-man race. So on primary night, Bobby Kennedy narrowly won the California primary. And a lot of outsiders who didn't really know much what was going on said, okay, this is it. He has clinched the nomination. But he hadn't. And if you watch the old footage of the newscasters announcing the results and analyzing them and talking about what's going on, they were saying this might look very nice for Robert Kennedy, but he's not going to get the nomination. Humphrey, working behind the scenes with Lyndon Johnson's support, has already racked up enough committed delegates that he is almost certain to be nominated. So now to this day, there is a highly developed myth that Bobby Kennedy, if only, would have been the Democrat nominee. It's not true. He would not have won the nomination. But that's what a lot of people like to believe. Anyway, just a few minutes after he had given his victory speech, having claimed victory in the California primary, as he was walking out of the ballroom and through a kitchen to get back to his headquarters, he was shot by a fellow named Sirhan Sirhan. He was a Palestinian refugee, a Palestinian Christian, who was very, very anti-Israel. And he hated Bobby Kennedy because of Kennedy's pro-Israel stance. And so he decided to go ahead and shoot Kennedy. Sirhan was unbalanced. He was a crazy man, though not legally insane. His diaries showed this. But be that as it may, he shot Robert Kennedy. Kennedy died one day later from his wounds, and of course that pretty much ended the campaign right there for the nomination, because now Kennedy was dead. His delegates, a lot of them would go to McCarthy, but some of the others would go to Humphrey, and Humphrey already had the race pretty much locked up. McCarthy's campaign had been pretty much just a run to make his point from the get-go. He had never looked like he was going to win the nomination. But now, with Bobby Kennedy out of the picture, there was no chance that the Democratic Convention would deadlock, which was all that McCarthy could hope for, that there would be a deadlock between several candidates and he would finally be chosen as a compromise candidate. That wasn't going to happen now. On the Republican side, well, it was Nixon, the front runner, Rockefeller, who had decided rather late to get into the race for the nomination, and now people were really starting to talk about Ronald Reagan. He had not announced his candidacy. He had not appeared on the ballot in any of the primaries except in California, where he was running as a favorite son, so to speak. But on the eve of the Republican convention, Reagan announced, yeah, I'm a candidate after all. So at the Republican convention, you had a little bit of suspense. There was Nixon, the front runner, Rockefeller in second place in number of committed delegates, Reagan in third place, and then quite a few other delegates controlled by favorite son candidates, that is to say, candidates who were supported by only the delegation of their home state. That's something that was much more common then than it is now. A state might nominate its governor, for example, as a so-called favorite son candidate, and the governor would control those delegates and might be able to use them as a bargaining chip if there were a deadlock at the convention. It was so much more interesting in those days because usually the nomination was decided at the convention, and there would be a lot of dickering and horse trading going on behind the scenes and sometimes right on the convention floor. And the nomination would be brokered at the convention rather than being decided in the primaries, as is much more common today. So what Rockefeller and Reagan were both hoping, and they were kind of working together even though they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, they were hoping that if they could each peel off a few delegates from Nixon, they could cause a deadlock. Nixon would come in first on the first ballot, Rockefeller would come in second, Reagan would come in third, but no candidate would have a majority. You have to have a majority to be nominated. So on the second ballot and the third ballot, anything could happen. Nixon might slowly lose support, and then it would be a showdown between Rockefeller and Reagan. And what a lot of party insiders hoped was that they could have a ticket of Rockefeller for president and Reagan for vice president. That would be Rockefeller representing the left wing of the party, Reagan representing the right wing. Both sides would be more or less happy if they had a ticket of Rockefeller and Reagan. A lot of people didn't like Nixon because they knew he was a hard worker. They knew that he knew his stuff, but they just weren't confident that he could win in November because, after all, he hadn't won in November of 1960. And they felt that maybe Lyndon Johnson's support of Hubert Humphrey would be a hard obstacle for Nixon to overcome. So a lot of Republicans were not terribly enthusiastic about nominating Dick Nixon. But as it turned out, he did have the delegate votes wrapped up. He was nominated on the first ballot. For his vice presidential nominee, he chose an obscure fellow named Spiro Agnew. Agnew was the governor of Maryland. He was perceived at that time as being sort of a progressive liberal type of Republican. And Nixon thought that he would be acceptable to the left wing of his party, but since he was from a border state, Maryland, he would also be acceptable to Southern Republicans. And it was very, very important at that time that Nixon get the vote of Southern Republicans and Southern independents as well. At that time, the Solid South, as it was called, was solidly Democrat. Goldwater had peeled off a few votes in 1964, a few states in 1964, because the South was concerned about states' rights and about civil rights legislation, and Goldwater opposed civil rights legislation. So the South was sort of slowly starting to drift toward the Republicans. But there was a wrench in the works in 1968. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who was a Democrat, was threatening to run for president as a third-party candidate. He wouldn't probably do very well in the rest of the country, but he would do well enough in the South that he could conceivably carry most of the southern states, and that would cause a deadlock in the Electoral College. So Nixon was hoping that he would sort of face off against Wallace in the South and against Humphrey in the rest of the country. But he would have to peel off a few of those southern states. So his vice presidential choice was important. He wanted to have a man from a border state like Agnew who would not alienate the rest of the South. So that was how the Republican ticket came to be in 1968, Dick Nixon and Spiro Agnew. Meanwhile, George Wallace was preparing to run as a third-party candidate, focusing mostly on the South, but hoping also that he might have some influence in some of the big industrial states, such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, maybe even New Jersey. Well, at the same time as this was going on, and the Democrats were horrified about this because Wallace was going to take votes away mainly from them. And they had that problem, plus the demonstrations against the Vietnam War were really coming to a head, and various organizations of left-wing agitators were planning to disrupt the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. So going into the Democrat Convention of 1968, the Democrat Party was in chaos. It did not look like Humphrey could avoid being nominated. He certainly would be nominated. But it looked like with Wallace on the one side of him, Nixon on the other side of him, and these peace demonstrators right in front of him, he was going to be in terrible, terrible trouble in the fall and probably was not going to win the election. So we go into the Democratic Convention of 1968. There are thousands of demonstrators outside the convention hall. There's confusion inside the convention hall because McCarthy's supporters are not going gently. They are going to fight all the way on the convention floor. Meanwhile, the Chicago police are not making matters any better because they are preparing to crack down good and hard on these peace demonstrators if they are given a chance. So it all came to a head on the night of Wednesday, August 28th. That was the night of the actual nomination. The demonstrators got a little out of hand, provoked the cops somewhat. The cops had an overreaction, totally out of proportion to the original provocation, as often happens, and there was complete chaos on the streets of Chicago. Demonstrators were being roughed up by the cops, billy clubbed, tear gassed, maced, dragged into paddy wagons and dragged off to jail. The cops just went crazy. They weren't just beating on the demonstrators, they were beating on the reporters. They were beating on who were covering the incident. They were beating up bystanders. It was generally called a police riot, and that's pretty close to what it was. This was all unfolding on national TV. The demonstrators started chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." And by God, the whole world was watching, and they blamed this disturbance not so much on the demonstrators, but they blamed it on the Democratic mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, who, of course, was in charge of the police. And by extension, they blamed it on the Democratic Party for not nominating the left-wing candidate, Eugene McCarthy, for nominating Lyndon Johnson's tool, Hubert Humphrey. And boy, by the time the nomination process had closed, the Democratic Party was in a shambles, and it looked like they were not going to recover. Maybe not this year, and maybe not in years to come. It looked, going into the campaign of 1968, as though Richard Nixon were going to win in a walk. On our next show, I will tell you about the campaign and how that turned out after the conventions. For now, I'll say goodnight till next time.